Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening for the November Europa Book Club. I'm Tatiana. I'm the assistant publicist here at Europa Editions, and I've been the one spearheading and running this club since we started it back in May. This month, we've been reading All God's Children by Aaron Gwyn. It's a novel about the remarkable people living on the edge of freedom and slavery, bringing to life all the paradoxes of the American frontier, and we're very excited to discuss it tonight. As usual, you will be muted during the event, but that doesn't mean that you're silenced. You can talk with us in the chat and drop your questions for Aaron and Nick in there as well. There is a raise hand function on Zoom, so if during the Q&A session at the end, you feel the need to ask your question out loud or just want to talk to them, we'll be able to unmute you, so make sure that you do that. Otherwise, just drop your questions in the chat and we'll make sure that they get them. So joining us tonight is author Aaron Gwyn. Aaron is the author of 3 novels. His fiction has appeared in his story collection, Dog on the Cross, which was a finalist for the New York Public Library's Young Lions Fiction Award, as well as numerous magazines and anthologies such as Esquire, McSweeney's Best of the West, and Every True Pleasure, LGBTQ Tales of North Carolina. He is an associate professor of English at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, where he teaches fiction writing and American literature. Also joining us is Nick Arvin. Nick is a fellow Europa author, and Europa published his novel Mad Boy, a rollicking and picaresque novel about family and perseverance set during America's Forgotten War of 1812 back in 2018. Nick grew up in Clio, Michigan, and studied writing at the Iowa Writers Workshop. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Plowshares, and many, many other places. His writing has been honored with awards from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the American Library Association, the Isherwood Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Thanks for joining us tonight, Aaron and Nick. How are you?
We're doing well, thank you.
Good. Okay, let's get into it. Nick, I'm going to pass the baton over to you and let's start.
All right. You can hear me all right?
Yeah.
Good. Well, so Aaron and I exchanged a couple messages before this, and I think what we'd like to do is Aaron's going to read a short passage from the book to kind of give everybody a baseline, and then we'll start talking about it.
Sounds great. Take it away.
I came down that winter from Kentucky, traveling the river on a flatboat with 2 other passengers and a cargo of ice. There were crates and crates of it, packed in sawdust and stacked shoulder high. Those days, most folks hadn't heard of buying ice. I don't doubt, but there were some in the South who'd hardly seen it. If I'd done as Mama taught me and kept up with the papers, I'd have known about Frederick Tudor, who was building himself an ice trade out of Boston, cutting blocks from farm ponds and shipping them to Cuba, Charleston, Savannah. He just opened a market in New Orleans, which is where me and that barge were headed. I knew none of this at the time. I figured the crates were full of bug juice or tobacco. I just turned 20, and though my folks had lettered me and hoped I'd take an interest in business or the like, little caught my attention unless I had 4 legs and passed in front of my rifle. My second day on the river, curiosity got the better of me, and I asked one of the boatmen what they were hauling. He was standing at the edge of the craft, staring into the brown water, keeping an eye out for sawyers. A tree trunk would stave the bottom of a boat quick as you could holler hickory. It's ice, he told me. How's that? Ice, he said. I figured he was just jobbing me, but he looked serious enough. I asked what they were carrying that for, and he told me they sold it. Folks give you money for ice? As long as it ain't melted, he said. Well, I might have just been a tanner's boy from Butler County, but I figured I knew a swindle when I heard it. I remember thinking any city that'd pay for ice was liable to slap a tax on well water. God Almighty, what did they charge for sunshine? New Orleans was only a way station for me. The previous year, I'd attended a talk where a man told us that the federal government of Mexico was promising 177 acres of farmland and 4,000 of pasture to families willing to settle between the Sabine and the Nueces. His name was Sterling Robertson. Wasn't much to look at, but he could have sold socks to savages. He said that in Texas there was every kind of game: deer and antelope, turkey and bear, bee trees and grapes, persimmon trees and cherries. The climate was mild, and there were Mexican soldiers to keep the Indians at bay. Sliding down the river on that flatboat, I thought how Robertson made Texas sound like Eden before the fall. Or Kentucky. Kentucky back in Boone's day before the slavers came. I sat watching the country drift past, the fields and farms, the wooding places where steamboats put in to collect fuel for their fireboxes. My heart was homesick and heavy, but every mile south seemed to lift the burden of it. I still thought you could leave America, where the planners and plant managers had everything locked down and laid out. Texas was a free frontier, promising folks like me the chance to start fresh. It's a peculiar sort of man who needs a fresh start by the age of 20, but I was always peculiar. I reckon that 20 seemed old to me at the time. Now it seems so young. It was certainly too young to understand that America wasn't something you left as much as it was something that you carried, a shape inside yourself, the way stone is shaped by water, all these channels carved inside your soul. So while you might have thought you were living in America, all that time, it was living in you.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah, well, I love this book. I think it's an incredible novel. The historical aspects are, just clearly really well researched, but also the sense of character I thought was profound, and it's got this intricate plotting in the pattern of like a classical tragedy. And it captures both the historical sweep and the personal in a way that I think is just incredible. How did this book start for you? Like, I could see a 1,000 places there this book could have started. I'm curious what the starting point was.
That's a great question. I actually, the child at the very end of the book, who's the son of Sam and Cecilia, I started writing about him, and he's a historical figure named Robert Lemons. Was an African-American man who was born into slavery, and then after the Civil War became the most prominent Mustanger in the Old West, and he was a famous catcher of wild horses. I read about him and I was completely entranced, and I began to write all these pages about him. My pursuit of Robert led me back to his mother, and then her story blossomed and took over. And I realized at some point, I'm looking at a number of different stories, maybe a number of different novels. So I took part that I could write, and that happened to be All God's Children.
Wow, that's amazing. And I'm also really curious about, I guess I'm I'm a writer, so I'm curious about your, like, this struck me as so intricately plotted. There's there are the historical events that Duncan participates in, and I'm curious whether, like, in your process, if you kind of have those points pinned down and then you kind of weave a plot around that, or how that works for you.
Absolutely. Out of a paranoia of getting something wrong historically, I feel like the early drafts created a kind of trellis that I knew, okay, these are the inviolable historical compasses that I can't mess with these. These are locked down points, characters, events, locations, and then I began to imagine into the spaces where I felt like, okay, there's some wiggle room for fiction. This easily could have happened, even though it didn't.
Yeah. And like I said, I think your sense of character is incredible. Can you talk about how you build your characters?
It's interesting starting with a character who was an historical figure, and in the finished book, All God's Children, he only makes it up to 5 years old or something, or at the end you see him as a teenager. I had this sense of who he was, sort of locked down, and then imagining his mother. I thought, okay, this is a woman who's enslaved. This is a woman who ran away numerous times. This is a woman who had a relationship with an Anglo man, and so those become these sort of navigation points. And then for me, character is the intersection constantly of limitation and desire. You know, what does a character want, and what is limiting a character internally, externally. And it took me a while with Cecilia, when I knew that her early in life, her entire organizing principle is running and being this escape artist. And freedom is the North Star for her. That enabled me to see, okay, there are things that she hasn't paid attention to because of that, because she's brilliant and she's accomplished in this one area. She hasn't paid attention to human relationships as much as some. So the relationship with Sam takes her by surprise. Motherhood takes her by surprise. So that's how I approached it. And then Duncan came out of an interplay with what he wanted out of Sam, what he feared from Cecilia. I think that triangle of Sam, Duncan, Cecilia began to solidify those characters for me.
Yeah. Did Duncan come first and then Sam? Sort of like, how did that come up?
Yeah, Duncan is an historical figure. Or I can find his name. We don't know much about him except that he was involved with Robert as a sort of employer after the Civil War, and that Robert cared about him enough that he dropped the last name of his former quote owner and took Duncan's last name, which was Lemons, but people mispronounced it and it became Robert Lemons. So Duncan and Robert were the earliest characters that appeared in a draft. And then Cecilia began to hassle me. It's like there was this presence that I was like, okay, I'm not sure if I want to go back that far. I'm not sure if I want to deal with this, but Cecilia asserted herself and became dominant, was constantly making room for herself. And I think she ends up, the way I intend the book, or the way I see the book, she, for me, is the heroine of the book and is the principal character.
It's interesting. I was struck that Duncan is in the first person and Cecilia is in the third, and I was wondering if that was instinctive or if there was a thought process behind that.
It felt right to have. They were both in third person, and it felt initially, and it felt right to have some amount of distance. You do a similar thing with Henry and Mad Boy, where it's this very tight third person limited. You switch characters, but a lot of the time, you're with Henry, you see what's happening to Henry, but you experience the world, the sensations of the world, and the thought process through Henry. He's this filtering. And so I wanted that for Cecilia, and I began to write Duncan like that. But when he would speak, there was such a palpable voice that was of him, and that seemed to me to be able to make those two narrative strands different enough from one another. So vocally, Cecilia had this third person voice that was of her, but then another shading would be, okay, what did people sound like? What did a country boy sound like in 1827? I began to read memoirs from that time. And so Duncan's voice formed, and I thought, okay, I'm going to allow a first person, which I generally don't write in, but became comfortable with because I wanted that for Duncan, I think.
Yeah. Why do you generally not write in first?
It's just instinctive that it's generally a third person limited.
Yeah.
It's not because I don't dislike first person or don't read it otherwise. The writing that comes out of me is generally third person limited, and then I made an exception in this case.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I usually start in third person, and I feel like if you go to the first, there's a responsibility then to create that voice for that first person, which it's like that much more difficult, right? But I thought you did it really well with Duncan. Yeah, I wonder, like a question I got a lot about Mad Boy, and I'm curious what your answer to this is sort of how do you handle that kind of voice, handle the voice both of Duncan, but also just of the period in terms of creating that voice in in the text. This feels like a modern novel, and frame it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like a modern novel to me. It's not written in the mode of James Fenimore Cooper or something,
Right.
but it has enough of that feel that it feels like it's of the period. And I'm just curious, like how you approach that.
So, in addition to like all the historical reading, one of the things I would do to get voices down. There's a book that came out in 1853 called A Dictionary of Americanisms. And it's A to Z, all of these phrases that were used in the North and the South. I believe the editor of that is a man named Bartlett. And I went through the dictionary, 10 different times. I would make index cards. And so any phrase or word or anything of interest, I would write the word down and then write the definition on the back, and get up every morning before I wrote and shuffle through all these, there were hundreds of cards, shuffle through the cards, sort them into different stacks. And then I began to feel like I had a familiarity with a certain kind of speech. And at that point, I began to, okay, well, I'm not going to use this idiom. I'm going to use this idiom from Bartlett. I'm going to use this. And so weave that tapestry. Letters of the period and diaries were very helpful. In the 19th century, you can't trust that the way people wrote is the way people spoke. And what was in style for much of the 19th century was this, you know this very well, obviously, this Baroque, ornate, flowery, sometimes purple prose. And I've found that the more rustic and the more rural the person was, the more they wrote like that to write, to like show or body forth some sort of sense of education, because they might have had some insecurity. People from New York often wrote more clearly and more concisely. The more cosmopolitan, the sort of, which you might not expect that, but
yeah.
That's
great. I was curious too if, like, I was sure you read a ton of books for this. Were there other like surprising sources of historical information that you drew on?
I ran across several years in. I ran across a memoir by a man. He's a character in the book, Noah Smithwick, and he's a friend of Duncan's. And I make sure that his journey in his memoir lines up with where he would be in the novel and that sort of thing. He wrote this book about his experiences in Texas, like 1827 to 61. And he dictated it to his daughter on his deathbed when he was 90 something years old. He left the state in 61 when Texas seceded. He had fought in the revolution and had done all this stuff to get Texas to be a state. And when they seceded from the Union, he headed for California. He was like, I can't believe you people, and never went back. So Noah Smithwick's memoir called Evolution of a State, Recollections of Early Texas Days, is for any like hardcore Texas history person. It's fantastic. There's really nothing like it. And the voice is very interesting. He's funny. His concerns are surprisingly contemporary, I found. And so that became a really important book, just something I've enjoyed reading over and over again.
Yeah. I was curious if you worked on starting a fire with a fireboard.
I did.
I did. You did.
It's hard. It's hard.
Yeah.
Anything that's in the book that I could do that was reasonable to do, I tried to do. I grew up in the woods in Oklahoma, hunting and fishing, and I always heard people said, rub two sticks together and all that. It made it sound very simple. It's incredibly difficult. Even you're nodding. It seems like you may have tried this yourself.
I have a friend who's done it. I've never actually tried it myself, but I quite believe it. It's extraordinarily hard. So, which kind of becomes a plot point in the book at some point. Yeah, it does. It seemed like that was drawn from experience. Were there other things that are in the book that you worked on, or you did?
I did. I bought replicas of every firearm that appear in the book, except for the cannon. Learn how to take them apart, and I just wanted to mess around with them long enough until there was something unexpected or a malfunction, something that people don't write about.
Right.
And then I'm like, okay, this object feels real to me. This object feels like it has a history. The same thing with the fireboard. I, messed around with creating spindles and getting tinder and all that kind of stuff. And when I began to run into the problems with blisters and do you rest your forehead on the top of the spindle, all that kind of stuff, all of a sudden, right, it's real for you in a way that it's not beforehand. And so all of my kind of research and buying weird stuff and going places I probably shouldn't have gone, there's an extended chapter that deals with the terrible, torturous labor of slavery on a cotton plantation. And it was very difficult to find depictions of what that labor would have been like. So I had to find people that had picked cotton and talk to them and have them tell me stories. They, of course, didn't do this as enslaved people, but they'd pick cotton in that region, and they began to tell me how you had to hold your hand and why you couldn't use a certain finger, and you'd stab your middle finger on one of the bowls. And that makes, I know you know this, that makes those experiences all of a sudden vivid and real in a way that nothing else can.
Yeah, that was another passage that stood out to me as a place where you'd clearly done your homework.
Going into researching and writing that material, my assumption before I began the research of cotton plantation, if you can call that life, whatever that is, that hell, was that there would be all of these sources, that there would just be a surfeit. And I began to read one book after another, one article after another, and still not find any vivid depictions what the actual labor of slavery looked like. Obviously, there are reasons why planters and white people left that kind of thing out and elided it, omitted it. And then you get to a certain point in the 20th century and people don't know, right? And so I sifted through a number of books about slavery until I began to find details that I could piece together and patch together to get a sense, a glimpse of what that might have looked like.
Yeah, yeah. What, you know, obviously it's the year 2020 and we're two white guys. And one of your
just thinking this, just thinking this.
Just stating the obvious here.
Right.
One of your main characters is Black. Like, what was kind of your thought process, and you know, how do you kind of honor that distinction?
It's a great question. When I started writing Robert, I approached him, my entrance to him and my finding out about him. This is a biracial mixed race man who was this cowboy and this mustanger. And I grew up on a cattle ranch, and I have an experience with, you know, large animals and horses and everything. And I began to write about him from the side of his physical skill. And then when I realized, when Cecilia began to beckon, my initial reaction is, well, I can't write about her. Like, I'm a generic white guy, and in 2014, I'm not allowed to do this. And I then begin to think, well, why aren't I allowed to do this? And then I began thinking, is it moral? Is it ethical to cut her out of the story? And then the more I thought about it, I thought, do we need less representation? Do we need less empathy? Do we need less of people putting themselves in other people's shoes, or do we need more of that? And I began to believe, and this is why I wrote the book, I began to believe we don't need less of that. We need more of that. And I think if there were more folks from any kind of background willing to put themselves in other people's shoes and empathize and feel and imagine what someone else's life was like, I don't think we would be in the terrible situation we find ourselves in right now with regards to policing in cities, with regards to all these issues that have been prominent this year.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to do well. You know, from my perspective, I think you did it incredibly well. But I think to write about that period and not tackle slavery as a, you know, just an aspect of American life at that time would be the real disservice. I don't know if you do this, but when I'm working on a book, I tend to think of it in some ways as kind of a descendant of certain other books that, you know, books that I love. And I'm curious, you know, what those books might be for you. What are the books that this is in the lineage of?
I was really inspired by Philip Meyer's The Sun when I read it in 2013. I reviewed it for Esquire and didn't know Meyer's work then, and they sent me a galleys. And I was just like, it was a revelation. I think that is an incredible, incredible book. Absalom is perennially something I reread constantly. I teach constantly. Though there aren't thematic echoes between them, Blood Meridian is a sort of Bible of that time and of violence and human degeneration that I go back to every few years. I've read it. I don't know how many times I've read it. I don't know how many times I've taught it. So those three books, I would also say Beloved and Moby Dick.
Yeah, all great books.
Those are all fantastic books. Those are all fantastic books.
Yeah.
I'm not putting my book in the same league as those books, but those are, those are the aspirational.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned at one point, you mentioned working on this for several years. How long were you working on it?
I started in the summer of 2013.
Okay. Yeah.
So I wrote a 400-page draft. I had a 400-page draft by the end of 2016 that I threw away, and I restarted at the end of 2016. Such is this crazy profession that you and I, for some reason, have decided this is what we're going to do with our lives.
Yeah, that's the way it goes. Well, it's just a great book.
Thank you.
I wonder if we want to open it up to the questions from the audience. And that's
Okay, sorry, I had to unmute myself. We've got quite a few, which is great. The first is from Tracy, who's a recent import to Florida. She wants to know, Aaron, if there are any authors writing in the genre of All God's Children, old or recent, which you really admire and might see as a mentor, whether it's from when you were younger to now, or even a new mentor or a mentor you found while you were writing the book.
People I knew, people I got to know.
Doesn't have to be who you knew. It can be. That's super interesting as well. But even just writers you've admired.
I would say Cormac McCarthy, who I struggle with because he's too close to me, and he's been I think it's no secret he's my favorite writer. I love him, and because of that love, I'm kind of always bumping heads with his work, but he's a master for a reason. Faulkner, Morrison, Melville, Flannery O'Connor. I've talked about Philip Meyer before, but I really think with The Sun, he did something extraordinary. Anyone who hasn't read The Sun and loves fiction about this period, it's a remarkable novel. It's a remarkable book.
Another question that came in is from Bonnie. She wants to know how long it took you to write the novel. There was so much research that you did. Did the amount of research compare to the length of time it took to write the novel, or did it take a much shorter time to write the novel after all the research you did?
Right. So I'm always researching and writing at the same time. I'm writing everything I can get down as I'm researching, and then often with a book of this kind, you hit a wall and you realize, I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know anything about this. So not only did I have to do research, read, I don't know how many biographies I read of Lincoln, even though Lincoln's not really even in the book. I read a history of sugar. I read a history of cotton, right? Wow. Because I had to, a lot of this doesn't find its way onto the page, but all of this is informing this book that you're writing. So that's a great question.
And a couple of people want to know if there's a bibliography that you've compiled, whether it's in the book or on a website that you did for the book, that people could turn to as they're reading the book to look to what you were reading.
I don't have something like that, but I could compile it. And those of you who are interested, give me a follow on Twitter or Instagram, American Gwyn, and I'll type something up and throw it on my Twitter or Instagram for you guys.
How cool.
Yeah.
Ian wants to know, he said that he's read that you don't like your first novel, though he really liked it. And he's curious what it is about that first novel that you don't really like, meaning
right.
He's curious as to what major writing lessons you learned from your first novel through the second and so on into the most recent one.
I mean, sometimes when Norton wants to publish your novel, you say no. It's not Norton's fault. It sounds like I'm blaming Norton. I'm not blaming Norton. I'm blaming myself for publishing a book that wasn't ready. Ian is sweet to find something there, but it's not finished. And when I think about it, I have a really bad feeling. I have a really bad. It's a terrible book. Don't read that book. You heard this from Aaron Gwyn. Go out and don't read my book.
Is there any one particular moment that you looked back on it and you were like, oh, this is how I know it's not ready, that it wasn't ready?
Well, I think that was my first novel. I published a collection of stories that was well received. And I was trying to learn how to write a novel at that point. I was in my early 30s. I think that I didn't know enough about novel writing to know how much in its infancy it was. It needed years of thought and work and revision, and I didn't know enough at the time to give it that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a great. I'm always happy to talk about that failure because that's an important failure for me.
In hindsight, it's always 2020, and then you can improve.
It is. I learned things about it. It's, if I could take it back, I would take it back. However, I can't, and so I am also glad to know what it's like to have a book out there that is bad, that I consider that book to be bad, because that makes me. It also, when I say I'm really proud of All God's Children, I'm thankful to have written that book, it means something for me to know the difference. This is something that, oh my gosh, this is a failure, and this other thing, I'm very proud to have written it.
Nick, are there any experiences with your writing where you look back on it and you think, oh God, I should not have written that? Or you look back on it and think, oh, because I did that, I learned X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, I find it hard to look back on any of my writing that's more than, I don't know, 5 years old or something. It all feels like it was written by somebody different, and a little more naive, but less the naivete than just interested in different things, and not as aware of some of the what I think is important now. Is different from what I thought was important 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago when I was writing. And so that kind of comes through in a way that makes me wince a little bit when I look at the older writing. But I guess I was going to ask Aaron about kind of the, like, how do you know you're done question, and like that your story about starting this with with the boy, and then this book kind of developing out of where did that boy come from, like,
right.
When was the moment when you realized, oh shit, like I've got to shift gears here? Or was there that like right. All these pages I've written about this are going to go on the shelf, and I'm going to write the prequel to all this now?
Something happened for me when Sam and Cecilia connected, right? It's hard, it's sometimes difficult to feel something, hopefully some kind of power or something good. It's hard as the writer to feel something from what you've written as you're kind of writing it. But that was one of the first experience I had where I would go back and work on those passages. I would go back and reread those passages, and I would feel some power, some warmth of their connection. And that made me realize, okay, if I can feel this, then this is a cornerstone for this book. And there hasn't been anything that I've written on this novel project so far that affects me the way that does. So that really centered the book for me, and also taught me that, like, this can't have Robert as a man in it. This has to be about this love triangle in a certain sense, and it has to be about these three characters and their lives intersecting. But it was Sam and Cecilia connecting, which was surprising to me because I didn't necessarily plan that there would be this great love that would join them. Yeah. But yeah, that's when I felt like, okay, this relationship and how that plays out is going to structure this entire book.
Yeah, I wonder if you could talk a little more about Sam. Like, Sam is such an interesting character to me. He's absolutely central to the book, but he's also, he's not there at the beginning. He's not there at the end, right? He's
right.
And he's a very vivid character, but you only know he's of that triangle. He's the only one you only know through the other characters.
Right. It's a problem that I figured out with this book about how to write a certain kind of character. There are characters who are central to novels and who you feel like you want more as a reader. You're like, oh man, I wish there was another chapter with the judge from Blood Meridian. I wish there was right. And what this book taught me was, if Sam had his own POV, he's a lesser force in that book by some huge percentage. But there are some characters that are mesmerizing or something like that, when seen from the outside, when processed from other characters' perspectives. If you enter their head, you've messed up the illusion. You've shattered something. So watching Sam through Duncan's eyes, watching Sam through Cecilia's eyes, and brought him to life for me, but still, I needed there to be a little mystery with Sam. I needed not to know him as fully as I feel like I know Cecilia. I mean, I feel, I guess you would say, sort of psychologically, or in terms of like where the heart is, I feel closer to Cecilia than any other character. I feel like, I don't know, we share something that's very core, even though the externals are obviously all different. But Sam's a little mysterious, and I realize I'm going to have to let him be that to some degree.
And did you try writing in his point of view, or were you able to sense that you needed to not do that?
I always resisted that. I saw that this is a guy who needs to be seen from outside.
Yeah.
And I can't. And also, there was something about him that's animalistic. Cecilia often thinks of him as a dog, like this dog that comes and licks you and you pet him, and that he's also a beast that can turn and defend you. Like, she thinks about him in this really animal way. So I don't know. I really wanted to preserve that from the start, and the panther cap and all that kind of stuff, which is based on a drawing I saw of a frontiersman from that time, when he had these ostentatious, like, wildcat headgear.
Yeah. Well, you do get the sense of him as, there's a sense that he's operating on instinct or something, in a way that almost couldn't be put into words, right?
He would not be able to tell his own story, right?
Right. That's a good way of putting it.
So, Aaron, Nick, you've both written such immensely historical fictional books, both with Mad Boy and with All God's Children. Do you find that sometimes with the research you do, it can bog you down, in the sense of you're writing it and you kind of lose yourself in all of the historical context? Are there any major challenges with writing in the past, in 1812 and the American frontier, that you struggle to put into words because you can't fully experience it yourself? Like, it's different writing about present day 2020 because you're living in it and you know what's going on, as opposed to writing in those time periods.
It's a great question. I'm eager to hear Nick's response to this as well, his experience. My own struggle with the historical research and reading I love 19th century American history, reading one history book after another, is that when you kind of come out of the research and you start writing, your writing can initially feel very dead. It can feel bogged down by all these facts and weighed down. And you can feel like there's this mountain of information pressing down on you, and you're like, okay, I didn't do all this research to hamper my ability to write a book. I have to forge a path. I want to hear Nick on this though.
Aaron probably does too. I know writers or aspiring writers who want to or are trying to write historical fiction, but who never seem to get to the writing part because they feel an obligation to know the period so well that there's always another book to read, and that becomes completely overwhelming. I do a ton of research, but I'm pretty willing to just jump in and start making stuff up and try and tell a good story. And then, so I will start with some basic historical research and find something I want to write about in that, kind of how to center this in that research and start down a path. And then I think Aaron mentioned too, like there's kind of this interaction between the writing and the research. So I'll start down that path, and then I'll realize I really don't know what I'm talking about here, and I need to read up on this, and then you'll find stuff that's really interesting. One of the things that I've found helpful about writing historical fiction is I can come across a detail, a word, a scene historically, and I feel like I know objectively that is interesting, and that if I can find a way to put that in a book, it's going to be interesting. Whereas when I'm writing something contemporary and just making up stuff, it's harder for me to feel like I have any objective sense of what's interesting or not. So in that way, like the historical fiction can kind of go faster than when I'm writing contemporary stuff that I end up having to revise and revise and revise to try and make it interesting. But it's this back and forth between the writing and the fiction. The writing will push you towards something that you need to learn about, and then that'll push you writing in a new direction. The other thing that I do, or at least did with my last book, is kind of give myself a little leeway in the sense of like there's some level on which you're never going to know everything. Like you didn't live through that experience, you can't know everything. And Ishiguro once in an interview talked about how he thinks of all of his writing occurring in a world that's kind of like slightly adjacent to the real world, and I kind of have started thinking of my historical writing in that way. It happens in a world that's just slightly adjacent to the historical record, and that gives me some room for some errors.
It's very interesting. I had an experience once. I had read a bunch of history and done a bunch of writing, and then you hit the wall because you don't know what you're talking about, right? And so you really, you buy a bunch of books and find a bunch of articles about one particular thing because you're looking for an answer. And then, you come across that passage that explains X. Boy, and there has never been a geek like the kind of geek you are in that moment when you find that passage, and like 3 people on earth care about this detail, and you're one of them. And I confess to that deep, profound nerdery when it comes to that stuff. I absolutely love it. I love it.
And Aaron, Robbie in the chat has said that he loves the immersion and research that you put into your pieces. During that research, do you find that any issues arise, either socially or morally, inquiring into plantation life and slave labor while being a white man?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, all the issues come up. All the issues come up because it is so, slavery is systematic, routinized, industrialized evil. It is torturing people out of their labor, extracting labor from their bodies, denying them personhood. It's about the worst thing you can do to another person. And this country that I love participated in that for centuries. And after the United States was the United States of America, knowingly perpetuated this for decades. And we feel, I believe, the repercussions of that today. So as a white guy, I can say, well, that's all really unpleasant. And I don't want to think about that shit. Or you can say, okay, what am I? Am I, I'm a novelist. What can I do about things that are past? Well, I can face it head on and try to understand as best I can. Try to tell a story as best I can that takes in this horrific side of a country that I love. And so, yes, I think it's a great question, and I thought about it every day I was writing it, and I'm not done thinking about it.
I think that's very well put. Do you use that mentality of, facing things head on, even when you're doing, I mean, back then, there were plenty of people that unfortunately were treated in horrible, horrible ways because of what the state of the country was at that time. And do you just do you try to like emotionally disconnect yourself when you're looking at it, or do you put your emotions into it? How does that work when you're writing about these things, or even about the opposite sex, which you'll never know what it's like to be a woman either, whether it's today or back then, especially considering that you said you felt closest to Cecilia, and I'm sure plenty of authors struggle with writing about the opposite sex as well.
Sure. I didn't want to numb myself. I wanted all, as much as I could feel, as much as I could take in, as much as I could empathize, as much as I could take this into myself. And it's information that I'm reading in a comfortable home in the 21st century with Wi-Fi and everything. So I don't think I'm putting myself in the condition of an enslaved person, but as much as I could feel, as much as I could go there psychologically in that moment, or whenever I was doing research and thinking through, I did, and wanted to, and continue to want to feel and understand as much as I can with people who are hurting, particularly fellow Americans who are hurting.
That's amazing. So well put. We're coming up on the hour. There is one last question. There's actually two more questions that I think maybe we can take. The first one is, are you working on a new book, and do you just write fiction?
Yes, I did some nonfiction for Esquire, and I just can't tell the truth. And so it's going to have to be fiction for here on out. And I am working on another book, and it's a sequel to All God's Children. So,
oh, cool.
Yeah, it picks up with Robert, and it's sort of Robert's story, where I initially started.
That'll be really interesting to see, especially see you flesh out that world more, because it's already so vibrant on the page.
Thank you. Yeah, cool.
Oh, I can't wait. And I'm sure everybody else is very excited. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Nick. This was such an amazing and exciting and open conversation. Like, I feel like those are the best, when you can just be as completely honest as you want to be about your experiences and about how you feel, because we're all human at the end of the day, and it's important to talk about those things. And of course, thank you for writing the novel, and this conversation brought it so much more to life, which is, I think, what everybody here really appreciated. And of course, thank you to our readers, all of you that are here with us tonight, those of you who submitted the questions. You had such good questions.
Great questions. Great
So
questions.
fantastic. I wish we could go on longer because there were more, but
Awesome.
unfortunately. It's okay. Well, we can have, when the sequel comes out, we can have another one and talk
Awesome.
more.
Awesome. Thank you, Tatiana. Thanks to Nick too.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Aaron.
All right. Take care, y'all.